Hello, it's Sue Fletcher here, the astrologer. So today I want to talk about Chiron, which is known as the planet of healing. So Chiron was spotted in the sky back in 1977 by an astronomer called Charles Kowel. He was a Canadian astronomer, not an astrologer, an astronomer. And yes, and at that time it was just when alternative therapies were being coming into the fore really. So things like reflexology or massage or a bit of chiropractic work or osteopathy or acupuncture, all those things were slightly coming in at that time. And actually, if you were doing those kind of things, you were thought to be a bit strange because it wasn't mainstream then at all. But now, all those years later, we know that a lot of those things are actually in the hospitals. I know reflexology is, and I know Reiki is, and acupuncture is, and counselling is. Stress release is, meditation. So lots of alternative things are now in the hospitals, which is great. So you can see how far we've come in a relatively short space of time. So Chiron was half man, half beast, half horse, and his parents could shape change. And so obviously when they mated they were horses, and then his mother changed into a humanoid, but she just didn't want him. She just couldn't look at him. She was disgusted because he was half horse and half man. And so she discarded him, and she actually asked to be changed into anything rather than be his mother. So she was turned into a linden tree. And Chiron was brought up by Apollo, and he was taught about medicine and healing and homeopathy, but he was also taught the other side of the coin. He taught war and archery, and so he knew about wounds from both sides. But he was a very gentle centaur, and usually the centaurs are very boisterous. They were known to be drinkers, have no manners. They were raped and pillaged, and they took what they wanted. And Chiron wasn't like that. He was a very gentle soul, and he was said to be the first astrologer and a shaman. So where we have Chiron in our birth chart represents where we have our wound, and it actually takes 50 years to go around our birth chart from when we were born, and by the time we get to 50 then we really need to have healed the wound. On the way round, it will square itself and then oppose itself and square itself again before it comes back to the exact position of where it was on the day that you were born. And at those times, the wound will come up to be looked at. There will be an element in your life where it will show, and you will be asked, to have a look at it and try and heal it. And this is important because we don't want our wound to affect future generations, so our children and our children's children, because as we know, we all have stories in our lives which we know and we've grown up with, and those stories really need to be healed. So let's look at where it is in the chart. So if you have it in the first house, and I actually have it in the first house, then your wound is something that you couldn't possibly do anything about. And for me, my father passed away when I was 6, so that's my wound, and I have done a lot of work on it. And when I was 50, it's interesting that I was doing a counselling certificate at my local college, and I'd not thought about my father, but I had to talk about him, I had to write about him, and I had to face it. And I kind of realised that it had affected my life in a lot of ways. deeply emotional ways. And so obviously at that time then I had to heal the wound, and I went on to do lots of family constellation work, which if you Google is a great way to actually heal your wound. It's very powerful and it's very well worth doing. So I have another friend who has Chiron in the first house, and for her, her family, her grandparents were actually all sent to the gas chambers. So that's had obviously a huge effect on her subsequent family, her children, herself, and so that, you know, is really a wound that needs to be really healed. And she has done some work with the family constellation work as well, which you know, has really worked. So you might have Chiron in the second house. So if you have it in the second house, the house of how you earn your money, and it's the house of self-worth, it might be that you have a problem with money, or it could be that your parents or your grandparents had a problem with money. Maybe they couldn't keep it, maybe they went bankrupt, and this is the family story. And maybe you're frightened of going down the same path. It could then ultimately affect your self-worth. So there could be issues about self-worth there as well. So then we come to the third house. Well, the third house is the house of communication and talking and speech. So it could be that there's a problem with speech. It could be that you're shy. It could be that you've got a stammer. It could be that you were told to shut up, and you never felt that anything you said was valued. So it could come out in a few areas, but it was probably to do with communication. It could also be something to do with your brothers or sisters, if you have any. It could be that you haven't got any brothers and sisters and you wish you'd had a brother or a sister. So it could come out in that way as well, your wound. Okay, so then we come to the fourth house. So the fourth house is the house of home and your roots and your ancestors. So there could be a wound to do with your ancestors. It could be that the home when you were small was a battleground. Maybe there were lots of rows. It could be that you feel that you weren't listened to. But it's ultimately something to do with the family in some way. So you could, because it's the fourth house of home and roots, it could be to do with a mother or a father, because the fourth house and the 10th house are both to do with parents. So if that's the case, that might have actually affected you and your life. So then we come to the fifth house. Well, whenever I've seen it in the fifth house, it is about the wounding of the inner child. So something's happened and you're very wounded inside. Even if you're a grown up, you're wounded and you've carried that wound since childhood. And once you've cleared that wound, then maybe you go on to help other people with if they have a wound, or if they feel that they were persecuted when they were small. It is the house of children, so it could be to do with not having any children, or it could be that you have had problems with having children, or your children are a problem, or not having children. It could be any of those as well. So then we come to the sixth house. So the sixth house is the house of home, of work and health. And again, I've seen Chiron in the sixth, with people who have an illness, and they cure that illness and then they go on to help other people with the same thing. So very often a sixth house Chiron person will end up being a healer of some sort. And obviously it's the house of work. So you could have a wound to do with work. Maybe, whatever you do you don't like, or you don't enjoy, or you can't find what is your passion. So it could be to do with that as well. So then we come to the 7th house, and the 7th is the relationship house. And again, I've seen this in people's charts who have problems with relationships, and this could be either sex. So I know somebody who's a male, and he's had problems with men taking from him, pulling the wool over his eyes, taking money from him. They've been in business together. But I've also seen problems with people with relationships with like their partner as well, and it's like they've come to learn about relationships, and once they stop making the same mistakes, because maybe they're quite trusting and then they get taken for a ride again, if they learn by their mistake and they heal their wound, then it doesn't happen anymore. So now we come to the 8th house, and the 8th house is the psychic house, and it might be that you're psychic. It could be that you are psychic and you don't want to be psychic. It could be that you maybe get messages and you don't want that. You feel you're wounded by it. Or it could be that you pick up on atmospheres. You can pick up on energy, and you take other people's negative energy in, and that can be a wound, and you could have done that all your life. So in a way, what you have to do is protect yourself from other people, so that this doesn't happen. There could be a problem with relationships. It could be sexual, because it is the house of sex as well. So it could be that you have a problem in that way too. So then we come to the 9th house. So the 9th house is the religious house. It's the house of philosophy. It's the house of higher learning. It's the house of long distance travel. So your wound could be to do with any of those. It's also the house of belief. So it could be that your parents and your grandparents were strongly religious and you aren't, and then this has become a bit of a wound because maybe they don't want to speak to you, or you've been told that you've got to follow their way and you haven't done, and so there's a wound there. It could also be that you will learn from this and again go on to help other people, and you could well be a teacher. Okay, so the 10th house. The 10th house is the career house, but it's also the other parental house. So you could have a problem with your mother or your father, but I have seen it with people who have problems with their mother. Maybe the mother's not there for them emotionally, or they've got an illness, or they were not mothering enough, or it could be anything to do with a parent or a mother. Because it's to do with work, I have again found that people will heal that wound, and then they go on to help other people, and they change their career and end up as a healer of some sort, probably a counsellor. Okay, so now we come to the 11th house, and the 11th house is the house of groups. It's the house of the world. It's the house of the community. So your wound could be to do with groups. It might mean that you don't like being in a group situation. Maybe in a group situation you feel you're singled out and you don't like that. Or maybe you end up being a healer in the community. Or maybe you travel the world and heal because of the things that you've been through. So the idea is that you have the wound and then you heal it and then you go on to help other people. I think you can see the way it's going. So then the 12th house, which is the last house. So the 12th house is a very spiritual house. the wound could be that you feel isolated. You might feel like you're the victim, and that you feel that you're persecuted in some way. So it's very important that you turn this around, that you're not isolated, and that you don't look at you don't think to yourself that everything always goes wrong, because this is a possibility with the 12th. But again, once you've sorted your wound out, spiritual healing and healing through the hands is really strong for people with a 12th house Chiron. But you may feel some kind of secret wounding. The wounding may have happened when you were a child, and maybe you've not said anything to anybody. You may have dreams, but definitely I think with the 12th house Chiron, you've brought healing with you into this lifetime to be used. Now obviously, unless you have your chart looked at by somebody, you don't know where your Chiron is, so you could make a guess from what I've said. But as I said earlier, it is really important that we forgive the people that have wounded us, and that's because we don't need to tell these people, by the way. We can do it silently, but we need to clear it for the future generations, because we know if it's not cleared, then it affects our children and our children's children, and it's not really what we should be doing. So it does take some courage to look at your wound and go and heal it, but it is like a weight has been lifted off your shoulders once you've done it. So I hope that's helped, and I will be back again at a future date. But for now, this is Sue Fletcher saying bye for now.